Welcome back to Flashpoint. A real side effect in this outbreak that people don't realize. A lot of folks losing their homes. In Charlotte, nearly 1,000 evictions in just the last few months of 2020. All right, Doc, talk to me. A lot of times when we think of this pandemic now, 1 year into it, we don't necessarily think of public housing and how it's a crisis for some folks and people being able to stay in their homes. Explain to me why this is such a big concern for a lot of folks.
Yeah, so we know that having a safe, affordable, and stable home is essential to people's health and well-being. But because of the economic recession, millions of people are at risk of losing their home, particularly Black and Latino folks all across the country. It was estimated just recently that up to 40 million people all across the country are at risk of eviction because they're behind on rent. Families are having to decide whether they pay rent or put food on the table. So this is a crisis that people are facing in the midst of a pandemic.
Why do you think it's being overlooked by so many in my industry, the media, by policymakers in both D.C. and here, in the States? Why is it something that's not getting more attention?
Well, I think people's attention is really focused on the pandemic itself and how to make sure now to get people the vaccine, to keep infection spread under control. But the second pandemic is really the impact that the economic recession is having. And we know that people's ability to pay for their basic needs has a huge impact on their health. And that is definitely the case with housing. I think part of the problem is that policymakers and other leaders oftentimes are not experiencing these financial hardships themselves, and they may not live in communities where people are experiencing the threat of eviction. We know there is so much segregation by income and by race. So oftentimes these problems aren't in front of folks that are making decisions. We have seen some response from the federal government, and that is encouraging, but we need to see more. In the short term, we need to make sure that the eviction moratorium covers everybody and that it's easy to use. Right now, renters who are at risk of eviction need to fill out a form and submit it to their landlords to say, I can't pay rent because of the recession and job loss. But most renters don't even know that they have to fill out the form or that they need to submit it to their landlords. So we should remove that requirement and just make the moratorium automatic for any renter that needs it.
Let's talk about the people who are even past the point you're talking right now. The people who in some cases are homeless or are homeless, that are about to be homeless. Here in Charlotte, I'm sure the same thing there in Philadelphia. You have tent cities popping up all over the place, people living in tents, and a lot of it happening just in the last year. What can we do about cases so severe?
That's a great question. And let me just say, in Mecklenburg County in the last 4 months, there were nearly 1,000 evictions carried out by the sheriff's office. So you're right. People are moving from stable homes into homes of family members and friends, and sometimes onto the street. So what we're seeing a lot of communities do is be able to use federal and state dollars to get people who are street homeless either into shelters or even into hotels. I think people have probably seen and read a lot about that. Now the challenge is many of those folks have been in shelters or hotels for many, many months. Now communities need to focus on getting them into permanent and supportive housing. And we're seeing many communities across the country doing that. They're leveraging dollars from state and federal government, and they're working with nonprofit housing partners to say, where can we move these folks into permanent and supportive housing? Because being in a safe, stable home, of course, is important in the midst of a pandemic. But we also know that it's a basic need that folks need access to, pandemic or not.
Well, we know leaders here in Charlotte have made it a top priority, even making a housing fund with $50 million to help try to address it. In general, what would you say would be your biggest pointers or advice to policymakers, lawmakers who might not always understand the depth of this problem?
Yeah. So I already talked about closing loopholes in the eviction moratorium. I think paired with that is making sure there is enough rental assistance that can get to landlords and renters quickly. So it's been made available by Congress, but now states and cities need to work really closely together to make sure those dollars get to the people that need it most, particularly small landlords that may only own a couple properties and who themselves have been hit hard by the pandemic. So that's short term. I'd say long term, we have a system where people who are struggling financially can get access to a voucher that pays for 30% of their rental costs. Right now in this country, only 1 in 4 people that qualify can actually get that voucher. We need to make sure that everybody who needs it can get it, and that more housing moves into community ownership. When housing is community owned rather than privately owned, folks are much less likely to be evicted during recessions. So those are some long-term changes that policymakers need to consider.
And we hope they are listening right now and watching this because we know it's a dire problem and a problem that needs addressing here in Charlotte and across the country as well. All right, thanks for joining us, and thanks for your expertise on such an important issue.